Unlawful killing of black people in America has brought to light a lot of institutional racism, not just in America, but even in the UK and countries around the world. This has made a lot of Christian Africans question their faith, which most people might refer to as the white man's religion. So today we've got Dr. Marvin Sanguinetti, a Christian academic theologian and a pastor with a combined experience of 34 years. He's taught MA and BA programs in theology at university partnerships and colleges across the country. And he has even run his own theological institution. So today he's going to be looking at this topic with us, the white Jesus. Hello, Dr. Marvin.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation, and I look forward to our engagement today. Thank you.
So thank you for being here. A lot of people have this idea that Christianity is the white man's religion, as people refer to it as, or that Jesus was white. I remember when I was growing up in Nigeria, I went to the salon one day to do my hair, and people were talking about Jesus, a bunch of older ladies. And I mentioned to the lady doing my hair that Jesus wasn't white. He was Jewish. And this lady got really rattled and really angry about my statement. And whenever I think about that experience, it makes me realize that Christianity in a way has portrayed Jesus as a white person, which makes a lot of people from my generation uncomfortable in believing in Jesus or accepting the Christian faith, because somehow they feel like it's not a religion that was made for us. So what's your view on this? Why do many people see Jesus as white? Why do people have that belief that he was white?
I think the first thing that we must establish when we say Christianity is a white man's religion is exactly what is presumptive in the question. By that I mean, what is the question presuming itself? It is suggesting that when we think about Christianity, we are only thinking about Christianity not on doctrinal levels, but on the levels of ethnicity and background. So there are a few things we must clarify in addition to that. Number one, are we talking about when we say Christianity in relation to race and ethnicity? If that's the case, then to some degree, the white populace has influenced Christianity, but only one brand of the white populace. So we could not make a generalized, generic statement by saying Christianity is a white man's religion. The second thing we must think about is, are we referring to texts and languages? So if we talk about Christianity being a white man's religion in relation to text and language, then it's problematic. One, because we know the Bible itself in Christianity fosters or includes several cultures, a diversity of cultures really, and in terms of languages. For example, the Bible was written in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek. It incorporates African cultures and various cultures around the world. So in that context, the statement wouldn't be correct to say Christianity is a white man's religion. Then think about geography. Christianity is a white man's religion in terms of geography? That again cannot be probable, as I've mentioned previously. You're thinking about the Bible being written on three continents, so Asia, Africa, and Europe. If it was only Europeanized, then one could argue the probability of Christianity being geographically and in terms of its location and locale, a white man's religion. But then you're thinking about the African context of Christianity or the African expressions of Christianity and so on, and the Asian expression. So the statement itself is somewhat delimiting. It cannot be a blanket statement. And two other areas, you're thinking about Christianity being a white man's religion in terms of education. One might argue, of course, that Caucasians have dominated the educational platforms across the world, and that comes with colonialism and later on with imperialism, which is the actual power, what we call hegemony or dominance of one culture over the other. So in the context of education, one might say, yes, we're reading Christianity through the lens of Europeans at times, but that may also be misreading Christianity, which I hope we will come to clarify a little bit later on.
How do you see, Christianity was brought to Africa by British people, the British colonialists. So how do you have people see that religion as not a white man's religion when it was brought to them by white people?
I would say first, just to add to what we have said before, it is actually what we call a miscontextualization. By that I mean we are reading history with a particular perspective when we say Christianity was brought to Africa. Why would we make such a conclusion without exploring the evidence? One, when we look at it biblically, for example, Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through to 15, we find Jesus, his mother, and his father moving to Egypt in order to avoid Herod. We remember that story very clearly. Yes. In Acts chapter 8, 26 to 27, we learn about the Ethiopian eunuch, very popular African figure. And I also want to add to that, when we think about the Ethiopian eunuch, when I was growing up, I thought the word was Candace. I thought Candace was a lady, but Kandeke is actually a region of Nubia, Nubia. So the Nubians from the Ethiopian eunuch had 3 Christian kingdoms, which a lot of Christians have not explored. Number one, you have what you call the Nabatea kingdom, you have the Mukuria kingdom, and the Alodia kingdom. These are kingdoms that were Christianized by virtue of a man that has the Christian ideals, sharing the Gospels and other avenues as well. So the idea that Christianity was imported to Africa is actually not historically correct. Africa had Christianity, some would argue, before Europeans. So that might be another.
You're saying Christianity was already in Africa before the colonialists brought.
Already in Africa. In fact, if you look at the Acts context, where the Ethiopian eunuch we just mentioned in chapter 8, verses 26 and 27, what you would find is this eunuch, this wealthy eunuch, by the way, contrary to how African Ethiopia has always been portrayed in the media as some place where the dropouts of the earth lives. Here we have an Ethiopian eunuch who was a very affluent and wealthy man. If for you to possess even a part of the Bible, the Isaiah scroll, that would have been an expensive purchase. So what we find is he was coming from Ethiopia to Jerusalem, right? We now call it the Middle East, which was originally Africa, part of Africa anyway, but he's now coming to Jerusalem to worship. So this man was already a Christian prior to coming to Jerusalem. He was exposed to Christianity. So his full conversion, one might say, happened post-Pentecost, that's after his visit to Jerusalem. But one might question, why would he be coming to Jerusalem to worship if he was not exposed to worship already? So those are some of the things that one can what we can argue by saying Christianity was in Africa before. Another thing I wanted to say, and maybe this will kind of seal the deal in terms of whether there was African Christianity before the white missionaries went to Africa. In Acts chapter 18, verses 24 to 28, we learn of a man, a Jewish man, and his name was Apollos. And Apollos was born in Alexandria. Now, anyone who knows history, any church historian, all secular historians know that at Alexandria, we have one of the first universities, the very first, and this is one of my my challenge to African Caribbean Christianity or African Christianity is that we become anti-intellectual. We don't like stuff like what we're doing today. But when you look at where we started intellectually, here we have Apollos, and he was attending and a specialist at a university in Alexandria. Now, if you look at the biblical maps, those maps we have, let me see if I can grab just one quickly. Now, sometimes, let's see if I can find one very brief quickly. Sometimes we have these maps at the back of our Bibles, and sometimes we do not utilize them. So what you will find at the top of Africa, North Africa, is where we find Egypt. And Alexandria is right there in Egypt, in Africa. Do you see what I mean? So the idea of Apollos, Christianity coming to Africa by white missionaries is a misnomer, because here we have Apollos, a Jewish man, an African Jew, if you please, that was skilled. The Bible says in Acts 18 that he was eloquent and mighty in the scriptures. So we're talking about things like hermeneutics, which is the art and science of interpretation. This guy was very skilled in this, even though not yet fully converted. Now, here is the thing. When you think about African Christianity being in Africa before the missionaries came, the Bible says in 1 Corinthians or 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 12 to 14, that the church became divided, the Corinthian church. And the question was asked by the apostle Paul. Paul said, some of you are saying, some are of Paul, some are of Cephas, which is Peter, and some are of Apollos. So this African Jew finds such a unique niche place in the church, in the Corinthian church, that he became a rival to the man who is accredited with over 3/4 of the New Testament, Paul. Can you imagine how powerful this African man was, that he was a rival in the eyes of the congregants, in the eyes of the Corinthian believers, the Corinthian spirituals they're called. He became a rival. So African Christianity is not something that has been brought to Africa by the missionaries, but the Africans had Christianity before the missionaries came. Here it is. The issue is a certain brand of Christianity, Europeanized Christianity, came to Africa, which usurped the African context of Christianity with its hegemony and colonialism. So the idea of control pushed that particular brand and suppressed the African expressions of Christianity. Of course, we're having some of those coming back, isn't it? Some of those expressions back in the West as well.
Okay, you've just explained that the Christianity that's famous or known in Africa is a different brand of Christianity from before. So are you saying that there are two different types of Christianity? And if so, what we're practicing now, is it the wrong Christianity?
Well, what I'm saying actually is that there is one biblical Christianity, but that biblical Christianity finds expressions with different cultural nuances. So the African context, the Asian context, and the European context. What I am saying is what was introduced to African Christianity was a Europeanized context of Christianity. And if you should go to many of the African countries today, for example, the religious expression of Christianity that is at the top is Roman Catholicism, you see, or the Church of the Anglican movement. So that expression became dominant rather than some of the what we would call indigenous native expressions of Christianity, with its music, with its culture, and so on and so forth. So that's what I mean by that when I say there's different expressions. So it's not that there are many Christianities, if you please. There's one true biblical Christianity with many expressions of Christianity. Of course, in colonialism, we have one expression dominating the other expressions, if you please.
This same expression of Christianity that was brought with colonialism, isn't that the same Christianity which led to things like the slave Bible?
Right. Well, one of the things I wanted to say about the slave Bible, actually, I think it's in Washington, D.C. at the moment on loan. And the slave Bible, the Bible itself has 1,189 chapters, right? And the slave Bible has only 225 or something like that chapters. So what we find is that the colonizers, they extracted particular biblical texts that will support the cause of colonialism and imperialism, the control of slaves. So texts like "slave, be obedient to your masters" was left in the slave Bible. But a text like Galatians 3:28, there is neither bond nor free, Jew nor Greek, but we are all one in Christ Jesus. That was, of course, excommunicated from the slave Bible. So the slave Bible was a manipulation of certain aspects of biblical texts by an aberrant form of Christianity used to control slaves. To be honest, in the modern context of Christianity, we would not now call those slave masters Christians, not in the biblical context of Christianity. Now, can I read a text to you? Because I think this text, very quickly, is an important text to demonstrate. Very quickly, it's going to be short. Why slavery and using text for slavery was not biblical, right? It is in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse number 10, and actually verse number 9. And in verse number 9, let me paraphrase it. It actually talks about certain things we should not do. If you're a righteous person, it says the law is for the lawless and the disobedient, the ungodly, and for the sinners, and for the profane person, and for the murderers, and for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, and for men slayers. But then it goes to verse 10, and it talks about men stealers. Interesting statement. The King James Version uses men stealers. The idea is taking up people, uprooting them from their context, against their will, and placing them in another context. And I think it's in Exodus 21 where it says, do you know, if you stole a human being and for slavery, for sale, then you would be put to death under the slave laws of the Jewish slave laws. And so, slavery, those who say slavery was condoned by the Bible, actually slavery that was actually forbidden by the scriptures, the type of slavery with which we are talking about.
So would you say the Bible we're using, how do we know the Bible we're using today is the real Bible? How do we know the Christianity we're practicing today is the real Christianity? Because many people have this idea that Africans have been manipulated by the Western world, that they've used Christianity to manipulate us, to control us, to make us see ourselves differently. And it's not a view that can easily be dismissed. Because I remember another experience I had growing up. We had a driver in Nigeria. Normally you'd have a driver that, takes you around. And he was talking to me and he told me that after God is the white man, that the white man is next after God. So it made me think, so what about you? What about me? Us African people, does that mean that we're not close to God? That when it comes to the queue to God, we're at the back, we're not close to God? And so when you hear and see people with these kind of views, it makes you wonder, were we really manipulated? Have our minds been controlled or twisted with, by the use of Christianity? So what's your opinion on that?
Well, first and foremost, any group of people, both sociologically, in terms of the structure and strata of sociology, how people groups gather together, and also psychologically, any group of people can be not easily, but can be manipulated. Right? So that is not unique to Christianity. You will find the same with Hitler and his henchmen, if you please. You will find the same in Mussolini, with Mussolini and Lenin and Stalin. You'll find the same with various cultures across the world, right? So the idea of trying to single out Christianity, to say that Christianity was used to manipulate Africans, yes and no. Christianity, but one brand of Christianity. Now, one of the things I also want to highlight as we look at the idea of slavery, remember that slavery didn't originate with Europeans. Now, that kind of, when we're discussing issues of black black equality and black justice, sometimes my Caribbean African friends, they get quite offended when we say that slavery didn't originate with Europeans. We have the Arabs who were enslaving people, right? And from them we have our own people at one point in terms of the African context.
Yes.
Slavery.
We even sold our people sometimes.
That's right. And the difference between our type of slavery, we were very tribalistic, and we did that as a part of a bounty. So you overran a particular area, you captured the men and you sold them on. But you didn't sell them in terms of chattel slavery because of just economic reasons, and you didn't sell them because of their color. You see, oftentimes you hear people saying, you're talking about a black man. You mentioned earlier George Floyd, I think it was, and we talk about a black man being murdered by white men. What about black on black crime? And I oftentimes said to them, remember that black people don't kill black people because they're black. You see, so the idea is there are different contexts of slavery, and we ought to differentiate between them. So yes, there are certain aspects of white Christianity that did use the slave Bible, for example, and such like, as a means of controlling even some of our elders who sold on slaves for economic gain in that context. But it was never the type of triangular slave trade that began in 1619 when the Portuguese brought the first Africans to the shores of America. So it was not that type of a chattel slavery. They were never African slavery was never placed people in stocks. You were never thrown overboard in a kind of yoke together, and that type of stuff. So we ought to differentiate between the triangular slave trade, what we call the first century Greco-Roman slave trade, where it says slave obey your masters. That's a different type of patron master relationship. It's not talking about the same type of slavery we know today as the triangular slave trade.
Well, Dr. Marvin, I just want to make sure I answer, a lot of questions I'm seeing out there. So even though you have explained this properly, I know online I saw something about a book that was written, like how to make your Negro slaves Christian. And people believe that, books like these were made because if you made these people Christian, they'll be easier to control. They'll leave behind their old tradition, their old gods. So what would you say about something like that? Because that's a typical example of Christianity being used in a way to control black people. So what would you say about that?
I think anti-intellectualism is the first thing that the colonizers did. By that I mean, if you remove education from any people, then they are going to be easily led. So education was the key. In fact, it is the contrary response to the question that you've asked that is of absolute importance. Because to the contrary, where people said the Bible was used to enslave people, it was actually the true Christianity in the Bible that was used to liberate the slaves. They began to understand, and oftentimes we don't hear about this, to be honest. We only hear about Wilberforce and all the people who brought the liberation and the abolition of the slave trade in 1833. But what we forget is the plantation slaves and even the house slaves, some of whom were exposed to aspects of the Bible. Because remember, they were trying to Christianize them. And the issue is there were people who were exposed to what the text says in terms of like Galatians 3:28. You can't always hide all the parts of the Bible all the time, can you? Not from Africans. No, we have a penchant to search things out and to find things out. And so what we did, we created a lot of rebellions. The slave rebellions. For example, the Haitian Revolution, which a lot of people don't talk about. You see, it's not that. Let me make sure I get this right. William Wilberforce is not the first person who attempted to abolish the slave trade. The Haitian Revolution, the Haitians did it before that.
You don't really hear about that.
We don't. So what we had I'm Jamaican by birth, right? And you don't hear about Paul Bogle and the Morant Bay Rebellion and Samuel Sharp. These guys were Baptist preachers who rebelled against the British you see, in Jamaica for freedom of slaves. And they did that on the back of the Bible. They did that on reading the text. And the text gives all human beings equality and liberation. And all human beings are made in the what we call in Latin, the imago Dei, the image of God. And once you perceive that concept of the image of God, you're going to rebel against anything that is labeled Christianity, but attempt to suppress other people groups.
So what you're trying to say is that Christianity is a force, what has been used as a force for liberation.
Absolutely. And sometimes even in our discussion in the rise of the issues such as Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, we tend to think that Christianity should be left to the side, and let's just do this in a secular context and stuff like that. Put the Bible on the back burner, and we will be. But the issue here is the text. The Bible is a book of liberation. Remember, even in the New Testament, when Paul, Onesimus the slave. Some of us we read about slavery. See, Onesimus, he was a slave. Paul sent him back to his master. But remember that Paul did not advocate slavery. He regulated an existing context of slavery, and that type of slavery, Greco-Roman slavery, is not the same as the triangular slave trade, because nobody was in stock. Nobody was hanging from noose on trees. You see, so we've got to be careful that we do not conflate one type of slavery. We do that what we call anachronistically, which means outside of its rightful time. We can't interpret slavery in one time, and then from 1619 to 1833, we can't take that slavery and then put it in the first century Greco-Roman context or even in the Egyptian context. You see, one has got to be careful that we don't conflate those. So yes, to answer your question, I hopefully more directly, the Bible was a platform and for liberation. However, anyone can take texts and manipulate others and witchcraft others and stuff like that. I mean, we have some of our own people who does that, isn't it? I am the man of God, so God spoke to me, so whatever he tells me you must do, so go and eat grass. That's absolutely nonsensical. You see that? So the true Christian would be able to discern by saying, oh, well, no, the text never says to go and eat grass, did it? The only person in the Bible that did that was Nebuchadnezzar, and it was because of his pride. So, challenge the text of liberation, challenges the assumptions in society that attempt to subjugate people groups. All people are equal, whether some groups treat them as equal or not. The text suggests that we're all equal.
Okay. So I think you've made me see things in a different light. I've never seen. Normally everyone's always talking about the Bible being used to control people, but then you've explained that the Bible itself is a book of liberation, and I've never really seen it as that. So thank you for that newfound knowledge. So is there anything else you'd like to say to anyone out there who might see the Bible as a white man's book or Christianity as the white man's religion?
There's a few things that I wanted to share, and I thought I'll document these so I do not eliminate the points that I want to make. For those who perpetuate and I call it the false notion of Christianity being a white man's religion, you're going to have to deal with the church fathers. So we've looked at Paul, we've looked at the context of first century Greco-Roman society, slavery in that context, but let's move it along a little bit to the first or second century. Here we have Tertullian, right? We learn about Tertullian. Tertullian is responsible to one aspect of Christianity in terms of his teachings on the nature of Christ and the nature of God. When you hear about arguments like what we call the homoousios, which is that God and Jesus is of the same nature and stuff like that. Tertullian is coming from that background, right? About 160 to 225 CE or AD. Yet still he was born or operated in Carthage or Tunisia. Where do you think that is? So just begin to think about where these African church fathers are coming from. What about Origen? Origen, 185 CE. He was born in Alexandria. You see that name again? That place, Alexandria, Egypt. So here we have another, I don't know if we could call Origen a church father, because there's disputes around that, but here we have Origen, and he's born in Egypt. What about what we would call one of the main church fathers, Athanasius, from which we get Roman Catholics and Anglicans and others, they get the Athanasian Creed, important creed, right? And Athanasius also was of Alexandria. You see how many people, not just Apollos, but now we have Athanasius and from Alexandria.
I never thought Alexandria was in Africa. Honestly, I never knew that.
Now, let me give you here's the bombshell for theology and for Christianity, for those who said Christianity is a white man's religion and the Bible is a white man's book, right? I do not know any theologian, or any scholar who has not heard of Augustine, or Augustine, as some people call it, right? Now, Augustine is from a place called Hippo, Augustine of Hippo, and actually, the actual place is called Thagaste. That's Thagaste, and that is an ancient city in North Africa. So the idea, yes, Augustine. I hope I got that right. So he's a North African, I should say. So Augustine is a North African, Saint Augustine. You cannot read a theological book without Saint Augustine.
I never knew there were any African saints, to be honest.
So the challenge we have, is what has happened here is that we have now we have been reading early church history through the spectacle and lens of European or Europeanized and a white Caucasian Christian lens. If we strip it off that colonial overlay and do what Rudolf Bultmann, nice theologian Bultmann, he called demythologization. It's stripping away, the onion until you get to the root of the onion. We realize that Black Africans have been central to Christianity from the very birth of the church and even straight through to our church history. You see, so that might lead me to something else, but I'm sure that question will come with regards to iconography and the idea of imagery and stuff like that. You may have a question with that a little later. Do you want me to share that right now? I can go ahead and do
yes, please. Yes, please.
All right. And so what we find in the early church, we have people, some of these guys that were debating about whether imagery should be used of Christ and stuff or of God and stuff like that. So they started out by using some images, right? As what we call veneration. Now, there's a difference in Roman Catholicism. Some Pentecostals say, you see them guys, Roman Catholics and Anglicans, they're worshiping the idols. They're praying the rosary. But what you will find that Anglicans and Roman Catholics would say, no, we're venerating the saints, which is another word for worship. But they're using the saints just like we would have used in a Pentecostal church, the oil or a handkerchief. The saints become a point of contact. Not that Pentecostals or Charismatics would not see it as idolatry, but as far as Roman Catholics and Anglicans, our Church of England, they're concerned, they don't see it as that. It's venerating the saints. So in the early church, they had this argument about veneration and making images of Christ and stuff like that. Now, let's be frank, right? There were no iPhones, and there were no Zooms, and there were no StreamYards, and so nobody's going to, hey Jesus, do a pose for me and let me take your photograph. No, nobody's going to do that stuff, right? Because there were no cameras, not at that time. So people are sketching what they think Jesus would be like. The problem we have, there were all types of imagery, iconography, and the colors of Jesus were varied. So there wasn't just contrary to popular opinion, there wasn't just a white Jesus, which came a blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus, which came later on, which I think is I'm trying to remember his name. Bozia. I'll remember his name in a minute. Just bear with me. I think I might have his name written down. A whole family of Caesar Borgia, but it's Cesare Borgia, the Borgia family. All right. So before that came, you had people having black Jesuses. You had people having white Jesuses, Asian Jesuses, all different. So
you're saying there were images of a black Jesus before this Western image came?
In fact, can I suggest to you, if you go to the Roman if you study Roman Catholic theology, and I did one module of that many, many moons ago when I did my undergraduate studies, and a priest taught us, actually, a white priest taught us, and he's an academic, and he told us about taught us about Mariology, which is the idea of Mary. And you would be so surprised that the picture that Roman Catholics use today of Mary, the white Mary, that there is I'm trying to remember there's a name for it. I'm trying to remember the name for it. Now they have a black Mary. Yes. So if you go, anybody who will watch this after listen in, you can go and look at just do a basic search online, and you will find of course a black Mary, and the priests they venerate a black Mary. Popes, not just priests, but popes. Now, if you want to verify what I'm saying, I remember now, the Black Madonna. The Black Madonna. Rather than having the white Madonna that you see often in some books, many priests, they have venerated a Black Madonna. I've had one student that I know about who have done a PhD, and she did her entire thesis on the Black Madonna. And you'd be so surprised if you go to parts of Brazil and parts of South America, you'll find they do not venerate the white imagery, blue-eyed, blonde-haired Jesus. They venerate a cultural Jesus, if you please.
Now, you're saying that everyone sort of drew Jesus or drew the people in the Bible based on their own based on their own races in a way. So in a relatable way, something that's relatable to them.
The cultural idiosyncrasies, they express the iconography to reflect that. So, and that's why the white European idea of Jesus, which came in a little bit later on, and I can facilitate the listeners with notes on that if they wish, which came in a little bit later.
Love the notes, yes. Yeah.
What you will find is that became a colonial. First of all, it was a photograph that was requested by the evangelicals, right? The painting was requested by evangelicals, right? And it was supposed to be celebrated, the white Jesus. It was supposed to be used to celebrate the 50th anniversary of a particular covenant evangelical church. That's how it came about. And it became so popular that even soldiers were carrying little white Jesuses, just like the rosary, to war. And it became, icons are very powerful emblems and powerful imageries. We all use icons. Think about the Nigerian flags, the green and white, or the Jamaican flags. The flag. You see, you think a flag is not important? Well, throw it down in the public street and start stamping on it. And very soon you will find out how important it is, because a flag becomes a totem. It's a religious emblem that represents the culture, that reflects the culture.
It's a very important image.
And so the white Jesus, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, because it became popular, you would be so amazed that it started what I would call a kind of psychological colonialism. That's what I would call it. So the paradigms of the people across the world began to change, that even black people begin to see the white image as Jesus. Listen, black folks, Africans, Caribbeans, African Americans, if you tell them that figure about 10 years ago, before the dawn of Black Lives Matter, but if you told them that white figure there is not Jesus, it's actually idolatry, listen, they will bind and loose, as we say in the African culture, Pentecostal culture. You see what I mean? So imagery was very important. Actually, I've got some notes here, just very quickly. Think about it. Let me get this right. So here we have this image. The guy is called Warner E. Salmon. Warner E. Salmon. That's Sallman. And he lived between 1892 and 1968. He painted the white image of Jesus, and it was called the head of Jesus. That's the title of the image, the head of Jesus, right? And listen, there are various versions of that from 1924 to 1940. He himself painted various versions for different people. So if you should get two of the white Jesuses and you put them alongside each other, you'll find that the eyes look a bit different, the hair is a little bit shorter and stuff like that. In fact, one version of that Jesus looks very feminized. All right, so yes, looks very a modern version of he will do well with those who support the homosexual agenda, if you please. So we know these are icons. Icons are powerful. They are influential, and you might not think it's affecting you, but when we close our eyes, we all create imagery, right? And most people in their minds, and this is the difficult thing, ask any Caucasian or even Africans, when you close your eyes as a Roman Catholic, for example, what type of Jesus do you see? And I guarantee you 99.9% of them see a blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus, because the image is there, whether it's correct or not. Sorry, I just get going. I'm very passionate about it.
Oh, it's very interesting. Like, honestly, I've never viewed things in this way before. Like, now I'm getting a better understanding, and I feel like from what you said about the history, about, Africans already being involved in the spread, the growth of Christianity, it makes me understand that I'm not adopting a foreign religion, but I'm adopting something that has been there, that my people have been involved in for a long time. So it makes me feel more involved in Christianity. It makes me understand that it's not something that someone has forced upon me, but something that I've always been part of as a Black person, as an African person also.
Right, and to add to that, very briefly, is that what we're having now is the same type of spirit that created the slave rebellions in the Haitian Revolution, in the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, and the other rebellions, and the various rebellions on the plantations, the cotton and sugar plantations, the various rebellions. It's the same resistance we're having now. Because
why do you say that?
And here's the reason why I say that. Because within the spirit of people who are oppressed, you create a kind of tenacity for resistance. Let me put it another way, in a more colloquial term. When you push people in a corner, they will find alternatives.
Yes.
And so, the idea is desperate times called for desperate measures. So what you're having here is that people have been suppressed so long, and even with all the criticisms that is given to Black Lives Matter, even though the founders have their flaws and they support agendas that are not our own as Christians, you find that Africans are aligning themselves to that because they're finding this as an avenue for resistance.
An alternative that makes them feel empowered in a way.
That makes them feel empowered. And that's what, if you go through and look at the pattern from the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks on the top of the bus, back of the bus, Martin Luther King, you look through all resistance, and even white resistance comes from that as well. Because Martin Luther, the white Martin Luther in the Reformation, he resisted because of suppression. He felt that they were not talking about justification by faith. They were not elevating the believers to become equal to the priest. And so he resisted, nailed his 95 theses, his essay papers to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany, and and declare 5 solas, they call them: justification by faith and by grace alone, and so on and so forth. So, when you drive, I tell you what, the movement that has emerged since, or culminated, rather, I would say, a nice theological word is apotheosized, has reached to its zenith in George Floyd's death. That George Floyd didn't start this. His death didn't start this. People have been suppressed for a long time and not given a voice. So whenever you do not give people a voice, guess what happened? I mean, I don't know about you. I hope I got Bogona right? I hope I got the name right. But think about it. If you have a pressure cooker, those pots we use when the meat is hard and we're trying to get it soft, and it has a little bit on the top. So when you lock it and it begins to boil, it whistles. Yes?
Yeah.
After time, the higher you turn up the fire, that thing, it's the nearer it is to whistle. You see, when things reach to its boil. When I was a younger person trying to learn to cook, I took the audacity to lift off that little thing at the top and ran out the kitchen the quicker I entered it. Quicker than I entered it. So the idea is, because water was all over the kitchen, the idea here is Africans, and whether Africans or not, but primarily Africans, when you have suppressed the people long enough, you have created in us a spirit of resilience that find expressions one way or the other. Let's give an example. Do you know what the expressions were when it comes to resistance during the slaves on the plantation from 1619 onwards? Here's one of the resistance. We shall overcome.
Yes, I know that.
So they use what we call songs of lament.
Yes.
Those a lot now. We have the more white darling check and the hill songs, but we don't do the hymns, the lament that reflects back on our struggles and how we overcome, how I got over, how I've made it over, those songs, because they're songs of lament, isn't it? You know, I remember, I don't know if I think it's appropriate saying this, but you know, in Jamaica, I'm Jamaican, so everybody knows Bob Marley, you know, and when you hear songs like No Woman No Cry, talking about the suppression of women in the ghetto and their struggles, so when you put black folks, African folks, or any people for that matter, within a corner, they're going to find ways of expressions. For Christians, we resist, but we do so within the confines of love, but truth. We are speaking truth to power, not because we hate white people or we hate anybody else. We're speaking truth to power because we want the same equality that God has afforded all people on earth. That's all we ask for, really. We're not asking for, you know, let me supersede you or let me become a Black Panther so I can obliterate white people. No, that's not what we're asking. We're saying equality must not only be seen, equality must be felt, you know, because every time a Caucasian person sees me as a Christian, he should see himself in me in terms of the humanity that God has created equal.
And should love me in the same love that God asked him to love me.
That's right. So that's I mean, these conversations are beneficial. So I mean, you get me going. So please give me the cue when I must stop. But you know, we need to deculturize Jesus, if you please. When I say deculturize Jesus, of course we have Jesus as African and Jesus as Asian and Jesus as Caucasian. But we must also remember these are cultural expressions that brings us into a spiritual homogeneity, in a kind of a unity between us, because in heaven there will be all nations. You see that? And I say all nations rather than races, because actually there is a singular race, but within the race there are different people groups. And I think if we start there, by the way, I must say this, Ogona, you might want to know that race itself as a word is a recent word. I think it was in the 1400 or 1500 that we have the word race. It's a social construct, and it was never originally intended to, I think the word, the etymology, the background of the word was never originally meant to subjugate a people. It was meant to identify different people groups rather than subjugate them.
I didn't know that.
But as the colonizers began to use it in this triangular slave trade, it then become attached to biology. So race is not just for division of ethnicity now. It now becomes a matter of biology, where Africans began to be seen as less than Europeans. And they had to do that as that brand of Christianity, because had they not done that, they could not mistreat Christians. You had to see Christians, Black Christians, as less than human. So you could treat them like animals or dogs or stuff like that. Because the moment you see them as the scriptures saw them, then you would have had to give them equality. And that they didn't want to do, because it would have undermined the slave trade, right? I have so many things to say on the matter of slavery.
Oh, I think we'll probably have to do it in another episode. But thank you so much. Like everything you said today, all the information you've given me, it's honestly made me see things differently and made me understand, like I said before, that Christianity is something that we've always had as Africans, something that's always belonged to us as Africans, even before, you know, the horrible colonization. So it's made me feel like...
Make a few recommendations very quickly of books. Is that all right? I should move away a little bit, if that's all right, very quickly.
That's okay.
All right. I had a friend of mine, and when she wrote this book 10 years ago, she was sacked from Her Majesty Prison Service because she was working for Her Majesty Prison Service. And there it is, Olivia Evans. And this was 10 years ago, before we had It's Almost British, right? And she reflected on the prison service. I don't know if they're still in print, but it's a great copy to get. And you might see David Olusoga's book on the BBC. He has done a good series on history, Black and British, good history, balanced history, can be read by any people group, Black, white, Asian, African, doesn't matter where you're from. And this one is for those that are actively racist and you want to engage racism, not just white racism, but racism across the board. There we go. How to argue with a racist. How to argue with a racist. So that actually helps both Africans to respond to the false arguments of white supremacy and stuff like that, and just white privilege. Really. And people say there's no such thing as white privilege. Well, I say to you, when can you imagine, Ogona, you're in a hairdresser's, right? And I'll do this very quickly. You're in a hairdresser's, and a white lady came over to you and start touching your hair. I mean, I can't touch anything, there's nothing to touch, but start touching your hair and say to you, oh, for a black lady, you have very good hair. Do you see what's latent in that?
It's an insult, really, not really a compliment.
But the idea is black people never normally have good hair. Only us white folks have good hair. You see, so these type of arguments are debunked by the books that I've suggested, and I've got a bibliography on matters of race and racism, balanced, academic, scholarly, not ranted, you know what I mean, but proper academic stuff that one can pursue.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Marvin. And we'll put links to all the material you've given so people could get better understanding and knowledge of this issue about racism. So thank you very much.
The opportunity to come and to share, and hopefully we look forward to maybe a part 2 to this where we can explore some other questions.
Oh, that would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that's all for today's episode, and you can follow the links below to see more information from Dr. Marvin, some of his articles, and also the books that he's recommended. So thank you and stay tuned.